Israel stands at a crossroads: liberal democracy or theocratic rule. That quote from Split to Survive, it really just throws you right into the deep end, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. A very stark framing.
And that's exactly where we're headed today. We're doing a focused deep dive, specifically looking at chapter 5 of this book.
Right, the chapter that really gets down to the nitty-gritty, defining the actual proposed borders between this secular state of Dan and a religious kingdom of Judah.
It's a compelling part of their argument, I think, because it moves past the why and gets straight into the how, geographically speaking.
Exactly. It shifts from the theoretical need for division, which they argue for earlier, to a tangible, on-the-map proposition.
Precisely. So for this deep dive, designed for you, our listener, the mission is pretty clear. We want to unpack the proposed territories for these two potential states.
We'll look at the reasons why they drew the lines where they did.
Yeah, the rationale behind it. And also touch on some of the challenges and maybe the solutions that the chapter itself brings up.
And it's important to stress, we're sticking just to what's in the source material here, these excerpts from Split to Survive.
Absolutely. No editorializing, just unpacking their proposal.
And it's fascinating how they tie this vision directly to, well, to recent political results, using that as a justification.
Right. The chapter starts by really hammering home the core argument. Division isn't just an option, it's, in their view, a necessity. They point straight to the 2022 election results, the contrast between Yesh Atid's strength in coastal cities and Likud and the ultra-Orthodox party's dominance elsewhere.
It's presented as evidence of this deep cultural and ideological split.
And they drop that statistic that secular Jews make up about 45% of Israel's population, and they're largely concentrated in these urban areas.
So the argument is that the map already reflects this divide, in a way. They're suggesting formalizing boundaries that, to some extent, already exist socially and politically.
Kind of like geography dictating destiny, as they seem to argue.
It's a powerful way to frame it, suggesting the borders aren't just plucked out of thin air.
Okay, so then the chapter gets specific about the state of Dan, what they call its essential core.
First up is the Tel Aviv metropolitan area, Gush Dan.
Described as the absolute heart of Dan. So Tel Aviv city proper, plus surrounding liberal suburbs, Ramat Gan, Herzliya, Kfar Saba.
Places like that. And the population numbers are significant. We're talking around 3.5 million people.
That's the figure they give. And about 90% Jewish, predominantly secular.
And crucially, it's not just about population density. It's the economic powerhouse.
Yeah, generating, 20% of Israel's GDP?
Something like that. Plus the huge tech sector, over 7,000 firms, massive export value, around $50 billion annually, I think they state.
So the economic engine stays with Dan in this proposal.
Which immediately raises questions about Judah's economic viability, but that's maybe for another discussion. The focus here is Dan's core.
And politically, as we said, Yesh Atid did well there in 2022. But it's also about what's excluded, isn't it?
Yes, the chapter notes the deliberate exclusion of Likud's strongholds just south of this area, like Rishon LeZion and Ashdod.
It really highlights that they're trying to create a state with a certain political and cultural character. Homogeneity seems to be a goal.
It reinforces that idea, definitely. It's about political and cultural alignment, not just lines on a map.
Okay, moving north then. Dan's territory also includes Haifa and its liberal surroundings.
Haifa is positioned as the second pillar for Dan. Smaller population, around 285,000.
And interestingly, they highlight the significant Arab minority there, about 25%, and frame Haifa as a model of coexistence.
Which suggests Dan isn't envisioned as exclusively Jewish secular, perhaps? More broadly liberal and maybe inclusive.
That's an interesting inference. And economically vital too, right? The port.
Hugely important. Handles about half of Israel's trade, according to the source, plus the Technion universities there.
Vital assets. And the proposal includes those liberal towns nearby, too, southeast of Haifa Yagur, Shahar Hamakim.
Alonim as well. Again, chosen for their voting patterns, aligning with the overall character of Dan. It helps create a more solid block of territory up north.
Right, so you've got the Tel Aviv core, the Haifa pillar, but they're separate. This is where the next piece comes in, and it seems really critical.
The corridor. Described as a lifeline.
Exactly. Connecting those two main centers through the Jezreel Valley, stretching all the way to the Sea of Galilee.
And the rationale is clear. Territorial continuity and access to absolutely essential resources. Without it, Dan is basically two islands.
Yeah, governance would be a nightmare, presumably. And it's not just an empty strip of land?
No, they list specific liberal towns included within this corridor.
Places like Kfar Yehoshua, Yifat, Sarid, Jinagar, Tel Adashim, Dovrat, Kefar Tavor, a whole string of them.
All the way to the western edge of the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, including communities like Degania and Kinneret itself.
And again, that selective inclusion, deliberately leaving out nearby Likud enclaves like Neshar or Menahemia.
It really drives home the intent. Create a geographically linked state that shares a broad political and cultural outlook.
And this corridor isn't just for passage, it has other functions.
Absolutely. The Jezreel Valley's agricultural output is highlighted, providing maybe 30% of Israel's crops, making it Dan's breadbasket, essentially.
A vital food source. And crucially, water.
Yes, securing Dan's access to the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, which the chapter flags as the primary freshwater source, especially, with climate change concerns.
They even give an approximate length for this corridor, about 100 kilometers. So Dan gets urban centers, agriculture, and water access.
It's a picture of a potentially self-sufficient, albeit geographically unusual state.
Okay, so that's the basic outline for the proposed state of Dan. Then the chapter looks at the other side, the Kingdom of Judah.
And the first thing you notice is the size difference. Judah gets the majority of the landmass, 21,000 square kilometers.
Much larger geographically than Dan, which is smaller and more densely packed.
Right, and its capital, Jerusalem.
With its million residents, a large ultra-Orthodox population, 40% is mentioned, and a strong Likud base.
And significantly, Dan relinquishes any claim to Jerusalem in this proposal.
That's a huge point. A major concession, presumably prioritizing the secular nature of Dan over control of the symbolic capital.
Judah also gets the Upper Galilee Safed, Tiberias, and the Golan Heights.
The Golan covers about 2,000 square kilometers, 150,000 residents, described as mostly religious or conservative. Strategic area, too.
Definitely. And then there's the Negev Desert.
Huge area, 13,000 square kilometers. Beersheba is the main city there. The chapter mentions its potential for development.
So a lot of land, maybe less developed, but with potential.
And then the most complex piece, perhaps, the West Bank.
Acknowledged as Judah's challenge. With 500,000 settlers and 2.7 million Palestinians living there, the chapter doesn't offer easy solutions here, just includes it in Judah's territory.
Right. And finally, those key religious enclaves near Dan's borders, like Bnei Brak and Beit Shemesh.
They fall under Judah's domain, too, which aligns with the envisioned religious character of the Kingdom of Judah.
Okay, let's circle back to that crucial corridor for Dan. How is it meant to function securely, especially running near potentially hostile areas?
Good question. The chapter details proposed security measures along Highways 2 and 4, specifically mentioning the need to bypass those Likud-leaning towns, Netanya, Hadera, or Akiva.
Security seems paramount for this lifeline, so what kind of measures?
They talk about fortification things like fences, advanced surveillance,
Okay.
checkpoints using biometric ID with controlled transit agreements, possibly even with UN oversight involved.
UN oversight. Interesting.
And dedicated rapid response units stationed along it. They even propose a width about 10 kilometers wide.
So a heavily secured zone, essentially, recognizing it could be a flashpoint.
It seems so. They understand the need for robust arrangements there.
Now, what about shared resources? Water is always critical. How does that work with the Sea of Galilee?
The proposal is for shared access. Dan from the west, Judah from the east.
Okay.
And they suggest a formal treaty, maybe similar to the Israel-Jordan water agreement that exists now.
So acknowledging some level of interdependence is necessary.
Yes. And the chapter notes Dan has an advantage with access to desalination plants, like the one in Hadera.
Giving it some water security independence.
Right. Well, Judah would have Jordan River access, but likely need more infrastructure investment. Joint monitoring commissions are also mentioned.
And agriculture. We mentioned the Jezreel Valley for Dan.
Yes. Reiterated is Dan's breadbasket, 30% of crops, liberal towns, cooperative farms. The potential for trade with Judah in farm goods is also floated.
Suggesting some economic interaction might be possible or even necessary.
Potentially, yes. Leveraging each other's strengths.
Then there's the very sensitive issue of people. Population relocation.
The chapter proposes voluntary moves. Liberals choosing to move to Dan, religious individuals to Judah.
Voluntary. And they even draw a parallel historically to the housing swaps during the India-Pakistan partition in 47.
It's a complex comparison. But the core idea is state support for those who choose to relocate.
What about those who don't want to move or can't? Minorities in either state.
The proposal includes guarantees of rights for minorities remaining in either state, similar, they say, to the rights Israeli Arabs currently have.
And they estimate maybe 200,000 people might relocate.
That's the figure mentioned. Providing for minority rights seems crucial for stability, if this were ever to happen.
And Dan's security, specifically, beyond the corridor.
The focus is described as border patrols, intelligence maybe using Mossad-trained units. Allocation of military assets is mentioned but detailed later in the book, apparently.
And the focus is different from Judah's security concerns.
Yes, the implication is Dan focuses more on internal stability and its specific borders, while Judah might face more external threats due to its geography and, well, the West Bank situation.
Makes sense given the different territories. Okay, the chapter does acknowledge challenges, right? And offer some initial solutions.
It does. For corridor security near those Likud towns, they suggest deploying maybe 5,000 troops, possibly with international mediation.
Tackling that head on.
For water disputes over the Galilee, it's that 50-50 split idea again, neutral monitoring, and reminding us of Dan's desalination backup.
Trying to preempt conflict over water.
And dealing with potential resistance to relocation. The proposal is incentives for voluntary moves, and leveraging Dan's government, which they imply might be more experienced, to manage the process.
So, proactive measures.
At least on paper.
The chapter wraps up with some context, comparing this modern split to ancient history.
Yeah, contrasting Dan's proposed shape, they call it a shape, like the number 2 flipped, with the old north-south split of ancient Israel and Judah.
Why that shape?
They argue it's practical, aligning with the 2022 political map we discussed. It's driven by contemporary demographics and politics.
Not by ancient borders. And they compare it to Singapore.
Right, Singapore's separation from Malaysia, suggesting the priority here is creating a viable state, even if the shape is unconventional. Practicality over historical symmetry.
And a quick mention of governance transition for Dan.
Yes, suggesting initial leadership could come from Commanders for Israel's Security, that group of former security chiefs.
Okay.
And importantly, planning for a post-split constitution with safeguards against manipulation. So thinking about long-term stability and democracy for Dan.
Right, building in protections from the start.
Essential for the vision they're laying out.
So, wrapping up our deep dive into Chapter 5, it's certainly a detailed proposal, quite specific, even surprising in parts.
Definitely. We've walked through the envisioned borders for Dan and Judah, the logic presented for those lines, and the thinking on resources, security, population.
It gives you a lot to chew on regarding the sheer practicalities, the feasibility, and just the potential future outlined in this particular source.
The level of detail is striking. It really tries to offer a concrete blueprint, moving way beyond just saying, let's split. It grapples with the tough stuff, territory, water, security.
Which leads nicely to a final thought for you, the listener. Considering this detailed blueprint laid out in Chapter 5,
what might be the most significant unforeseen challenges? The unintended consequences that could pop up if such a profound division were actually attempted, something the blueprint might not account for.
That is a really compelling question to think about. Food for thought.
Indeed.
Well, thanks for joining us as we navigated this very dense and crucial chapter.
A pleasure.
Until our next deep dive.